Morning everyone, welcome to the first video for 2017. Today we're talking about research paradigms. Now, you might not be able to do this in groups if you're sitting in a different venue, if you're one of my distance learning students, but I want you to think about maybe hijacking a few of your friends and asking them to describe something to you. And then think about how the way they describe it affects how you think about it and how you would describe it to other people. So once you start hearing how other people describe things, you might adjust the way you describe it, and they might give you extra insight, and eventually you might agree on a definition. Now, this is pretty much how science works too. We are all trying to describe and understand things so we can arrive at some sort of truth. Most quantitative research texts identify three types of research. Now, all the research is trying to do is to describe things accurately and in a way we can all agree on. So the first type is exploratory research. The second type is descriptive, and the final type is explanatory. And though they sound like separate components, they're often all evident in the same research project. So exploratory research is just that. It's when you're exploring a topic for the first time, you're not familiar with it, and you're now trying to understand more about it or define it for the first time. So it's research on a concept, on people, on a situation when not that much is known about that. Where you've seen a few things and you might have observed something and now you want to explore it further and understand it better. So you want to be able to explore the topic until you've more or less pinned down what you think is happening. Descriptive research is research on a concept, or on people, on a situation again. But in this case, you know something about it, but you want to explain what you've seen or what you've observed. So you might have driven through a specific community and you might have seen something. And then you want to explore that phenomenon. Like say you notice that one community actually is doing so much better than the others. The community is tidy, the kids play together, there seems to be very limited conflict. At that point, you might go and do some exploratory research. So you might speak to local leaders or elites, or you might speak to the community itself. And you might find that in that community, there's a specific church and a sense of belonging that's built around the church or around a civic organization. So you might then say that you think that maybe membership of civic organizations is maybe a source of civic pride or is a source of stability to different communities. You might then want to just describe the level of civic pride or the number of community organizations operating in a town. You might also want to look at their unemployment levels, but you can't really draw conclusions. You're just sort of explaining what you've seen. Now, finally, you might say, well, I think that community development and stability is dependent on civic pride, and civic pride, it depends largely on type of organizations that are evident or type of community-based organizations that are evident. And you might then test hypotheses and do this quantitatively using statistics. Now that's explanatory research. You observed something and you found out more about it. Once you've sort of come up with a concept or an idea, you'd achieved what you needed to from exploratory research, so you'd explored the topic. You've then described what you've seen. So you've gone in and you've described how the community spends a lot of time in the civic centers and everything else. And finally, you've tested hypotheses statistically and you've decided that actually membership of these community centers is good, or the community-based organizations actually has a quantitative effect on the way the community runs. Okay, so mainly exploratory research is covered by qualitative research. So we observe what's going on. You might conduct interviews, you might do content analysis, you might read what others have said, or interpret the transcripts that you have of interviews. You might also conduct explanatory research using quantitative studies and hypothesis testing. So at this point we start counting things and looking at the associations in a numerical way. Descriptive studies might involve both. So in a descriptive study, you might provide some data, and you also might provide some qualitative data from interviews or from observations or everything else. So it's to provide a sort of richer, fuller picture of what's going on. So someone can look at your research and have a better understanding of what's going on. Now, the type of approaches we choose and the way we see fit to arrive at what is true or what we can agree on depends on our paradigm. Our paradigm is the lens through which we see the world. So if you think about wearing glasses that have red lenses, those glasses with the red lenses would make the world look different to you. Likewise, if you watch a movie in 3D and you put on 3D glasses, the world looks different and the picture looks different from if you're not wearing those glasses. So it's our shared understanding of reality. It's assuming how things work and what the best way is of doing things. Now, both quantitative and qualitative research methods involve these different assumptions about how research should be conducted and the role of the researcher in all of this. And we'll cover that in the next few slides. As I said before, paradigms are pretty much the lenses we look at the world through. So it's our worldview, and it's our assumptions about how things work, like what is truth, what is justice, what is science, and these can differ a lot from person to person. And trust me, sometimes this can cause major arguments between people. So when you start looking at quantitative and qualitative research, you start to see that they handle the world very differently, and they handle the truth differently. And they have different assumptions about what is truth and how we can construct truth, or whether we construct it or whether it exists outside of us. So I'm going to take you on a sort of quick tour through this, but it's a fascinating area, and I would recommend that you read around the topic. I've put notes up. A good one is Guber and Lincoln, and I'll try and add the link in the description below. Now, the role of the researcher, like I said, differs in each of those, but let's look at some of the other roles that might differ, or some of the other things that might differ. Qualitative research is largely to do with unstructured, ambiguous information gathering. So you might have open-ended questions. An open-ended question is where someone can respond in whatever way they see fit. You might even have completely unstructured or semi-structured interviews where you start off with a specific question in mind, but after that you just let the conversation flow. You might use observations, and you might use content analysis, which is sifting through information to find themes, commonalities, and to try and interpret what is being said. Quantitative research is much more structured. So you might use experiments here. You want to control and isolate out any other variables that might affect the findings. You want to test things. So this is very much based in we use the word hard sciences for quantitative sciences, but more to do with physics and mathematics, and not so much to do with how people feel about things or allowing things to unfold in a more organic way. So the other thing here is that we might still use things like interviews, but we might use structured content analysis. So our rules for analyzing content are different. Our interviews might be more structured. We might use closed-ended questions. So we give people options and they have to select an option as a response. And we might also use observation, but then we might use strict observation schedules. So we might be counting how often something happens, or we might be looking at specific patterns that we're trying to identify and then ticking off when they happen. Qualitative research is way more subjective. So you as the researcher are allowed to interpret what is going on more according to your worldview. And they kind of say that, well, this is impossible to escape. Our entire experience of the world and how we create reality is filtered through our perceptions and our experiences. So you can't escape the subjective. But quantitative researchers try to make things way more objective. So they wouldn't like to have to interpret things very deeply. They'd rather use numbers and stats because they might feel that being too subjective will bring bias into the process. The qualitative guys use induction and the quantitative guys use deduction, and we'll discuss that in more detail, so I'm not going to cover it here. The qualitative research is also very unstructured. I say that, but at the same time, it's actually untrue. I would say that the complexity is harder to manage when it comes to qualitative research. That it's not that it's unstructured, it's that you, in order to apply structure or make sense out of text or talk or ideas or concepts, you have to spend a lot more time working through it. And so it's not a lazy cop-out. If you do it correctly, it can be very highly structured and logical. It's just the format is mainly words, so it's a little bit harder to maintain that structure. Quantitative research is structured from the get-go. So you plan everything a lot more carefully and systematically, because your hope is that other people can replicate the same study. When it comes to qualitative research, they say that there's little manipulation of subjects, but this isn't necessarily totally true because of the subjective nature and the fact that you're interacting with your subjects more. You're more likely to manipulate them through giving off cues, whereas in quantitative research, the assumption is that we might actually manipulate subjects, because if you're in an experiment and you're trying to look at the effects of something, you're most likely going to have to determine those effects and apply some sort of treatment. Qualitative research is time-consuming to conduct, but quantitative research might actually not take that long to conduct. The difference is that with qualitative research, you might not spend as much time on the planning stage, although they would argue that they spend a lot of time on planning. You might spend more time on the data collection, and then you will spend a lot of time on the analysis, and I'm talking a lot. Like, you have to give yourself enough time when it comes to qualitative research. So it is a time-consuming process. With quantitative research, your planning can take a long, long time. Could take as long as 6 months to conduct research that only lasts, say, 6 hours. And I'm not even joking. That's how long it could take you to set everything up, especially if you're developing an experiment or you're developing a new instrument from scratch. Then the data analysis and everything and the data collection is actually fairly easy. So the time is up front and maybe with a bit of time afterwards for coding and analysis. But with the qualitative research, it's more or less the other way around. You don't have to spend so much time on the preparatory phase, but afterwards, trust me, transcribing interviews and then which means writing them out and then running content analysis on them and then verifying your findings using literature and everything else is a long process. So if you are an undergrad who's thinking of becoming a postgrad, or if you're a postgrad, don't think that that's the easy route. Neither is easy. They both have to be done using as much rigor as possible. And as a result, the research is time consuming. Don't think that one's quicker or easier than the other. Now, the other thing with qualitative research is that there is very little social distance between the researcher and the subject. Remember, I already said that this is a little bit more subjective. Well, you might be interacting with people, and if you're actually having unstructured conversations with them, you're interacting with them in quite a personal way, and this could be over some time. Whereas with the quantitative research, to keep it objective, you keep as much distance between yourself and the person as possible. You wouldn't want to give off subconscious cues that make them respond in a specific way. So you try and keep that distance. You're trying to remove yourself from the research equation. You're trying to get to that externally identifiable truth that is valued so much in quantitative research. Let's have a look at the next slide. Now, I want you to think about these questions if you haven't already. These are the sort of questions that you want to be thinking about just without going into sort of existential crisis, but you've got to ask what the truth is. Can the truth be determined in every situation? Do we know what is true? Sometimes the truth does change from person to person or from culture to culture, so there is some relativism, but there are some things that are universal, so you've got to think about that. Like, can we agree on what is the truth, and what evidence do you need to see to determine what the truth is? So have a think about that. Now, our job is to create truth or knowledge. So we're in the business of knowledge production. And the problem is there's so much false information, there's false news out there, there's false science out there. Everyone can run a blog these days. So the first question here is, are things true if they're printed in books or the newspaper? Not necessarily. Okay. Who determines the truth? Who can we trust? Some people will say, well, they trust themselves, but you can't always trust yourself. Maybe you can trust scientists. You'd like to hope that you can trust scientists, but this is why we have the scientific process, why we have peer review and blind peer review, and why the scientific environment is so critical. Can different people hold different perceptions about what is the truth? Well, I'll leave you to think about that. Think about more contentious subjects like the death penalty or the right to life. Unfortunately, I see the last slide sort of slid off the page here. So my apologies for that. Is an individual's perception of the truth determined by his or her experiences or interactions with people? Well, you only have to meet anyone with trust issues to know the answer to that question. Let's move on to the next slide. So should society change or should it stay the same? Now we're going more into critical theory. Are things ideal the way they are? I think if you live in South Africa, you'll probably say no. We have a lot of development that we still need to achieve. Is it the researcher's responsibility to change society? Now that's a different question. Should we just be there to chronicle what's going on, or should we be actively trying to change things? Now at this point I must just say, as an industrial psychologist, I work in an applied field, so I have to try and change things. I have to try and improve things. But at the same time, I have to try and remain objective and neutral and attempt to find new knowledge. Now, how do we combine those things? Because they sound like they're slightly contradictory. I have to remain objective and neutral. In other words, I can't push a research agenda, but I can direct my research towards more positive outcomes and towards solving problems. So if I identify societal problems and then I find answers in an objective or neutral way, then I've kind of managed to reconcile those things. So should the researcher's personal experiences and values influence their research? If so, how do you prevent personal bias from influencing the study? Now, I want you to think about these things. The second half, we have to think about, we are not allowed to be biased. We have to make sure that our research is fair, unbiased, valid, and reliable at all times. But the first part still plays a role. Yes, if you've grown up poor, or you've grown up facing specific problems, or you face problems in the workplace, you're going to want to solve those problems. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing. We can't just blindly do research. So they can influence what we research, they can influence what sort of problems or research questions we want to address, but then they can't influence the outcomes of our research. In other words, we can't try and skew research to prove our point. That is unethical, and yeah, we're just not allowed to do that. You won't get away with that for long. So Gruber and Lincoln, who I mentioned earlier, describe these things really well, and they actually take you through quite a long process, but it helps you to understand all of these words and how they fit together and how they might affect what research you do and what you believe in. The research is, or the papers sort of specifically refers to qualitative research, but it applies across the board. So ontology covers assumptions about the nature of reality. Epistemology is how we come to know that reality. So what is truth? Does truth exist outside of us? How can we come to know that reality? That's ontology and epistemology. So is truth something that we create, or is it something that exists outside of us? Is it something that we can ever fully understand or know, or is it something that changes? How do we know that reality? And then methodology is the study of or the evaluation of different research methods and how we access and report what we've learnt about reality. And then axiology is to do with ethics. So what is right and wrong? How should we act? Now, if we put all this together, the axiology covers two things. It covers what type of problems we're trying to solve, in other words, where we direct our attention as researchers, and then it also covers how we should study that. Now we come to the research onion. The research onion is a way of positioning ourselves, starting with our philosophy about the world, and then moving on to whether we use induction or deduction to understand that world, what methods we use. So you can see that ties in with our ontology, epistemology, and then our methodology, and then our methods that we can use, so quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods, a combination of the two, or whether we're going to go cross-sectional, which is a snapshot of a moment in time, or longitudinal, which shows trends and how things progress over time. And then the final phase, after having gone through that entire journey, is to actually outline how you're going to do this. So what techniques are you going to use, and what procedure are you going to use? So what's your philosophy? Do you believe in a sort of external truth that can be identified through experiments and through numbers and counting, and that we should be objective? Or do you believe that truth is something that is created through internalizing experiences and processing them and then sharing that information? And then, the research pretty much covers every phase of research. Like I said, we'll cover induction and deduction later. So you have to understand your research philosophy. It's the term relating to the development of knowledge and the nature of knowledge. Now, all that says is development of knowledge is research, okay? And the type of knowledge that we collect. So, ontology is the nature of reality. What is real? What is truth? What assumptions do we have about the way the world operates? And what commitments do we hold to those views? So, the first one we could look at here is objectivism. This is the position that social entities exist in reality external to the social actors concerned with their existence. So these things exist, they're not constructs within our minds, they are something that we can observe and measure. Subjectivism, on the other hand, holds that these phenomena don't exist external to us, they're actually just created through our perceptions and then how we act because of those perceptions. So that these things are actually just constructed by us and or co-created by us. You can see it's almost the same thing, but it's just a slightly different angle, and that slight angle is a very important difference. So ontology is the science or study of being or existence, and it's about what exists. Does it exist externally to us, or does it just exist because we see it or perceive it? What does it look like? What units do we look at? And how do these units interact with each other? It's our view on the nature of reality. And is this an objective reality that exists, or is it a subjective reality that is created in our minds? So basically, we know that our perceptions aren't necessarily for instance, color is made up the way it is because of the way that light reflects off surfaces and then is received and processed by our brains. Colorblind people see the world completely differently. Does that imply that color exists outside of our minds? Well, it implies that maybe not, but we can measure light waves and we can quantify those light waves and then associate those with colors, and then we can put a little side note saying, well, colorblind people might see it slightly differently, and that's kind of objective. But the more subjective approach would be to say that color is something that exists within our minds, that we can't actually guarantee that we all see colors exactly the same. And they'll argue that this is more appropriate when we're looking at things like social justice issues or social issues, maybe not so much things in the, I want to say real world, but the physical world. For an everyday example, we could look at a workplace report, asking one to question whether it describes what's really going on or what the author thinks is going on. Well, often in the workplace, it's what the author thinks is going on. They then say that when we look at things like culture or power or control, we might say that they're actually an illusion. That if you think about culture, it's actually quite hard to describe or define a culture. A lot of people say you just know culture when you see it, and that's kind of what we're talking about here, is that culture doesn't necessarily exist outside of the people within that culture. But at the same time, we can see manifest elements of culture, and we can quantify, not quantify, but we can measure those. So it is quite tricky. So do these things exist, or are they an illusion, a shared illusion? How do individuals and groups determine these realities? Does the reality exist only because we experience it? Well, probably. Does it exist independently of that experience? In the case of culture, the first response would be to say, well, no, not necessarily. But then if you think about a culture that's died, okay? So while that culture existed, it was a culture. It was perceived as a culture. People acted in a certain way because they perceived that culture existed. There were symbols and rituals and things that you could actually measure and describe that were to do with that culture. So at the time, you could say the subjective approach would be to say, well, these guys have co-created the culture. Now, a more positivist or objectivist type person would say, when that culture's died out and anthropologists or archaeologists go back and they find what's left of the culture in records and artifacts and everything else, then surely that's a sign that the culture existed outside of the people who constructed that culture or understood or had a shared understanding of that culture. And they would argue that it's not, you can't say that you just, that the culture is there still, that the physical remnants are enough. They would say that the new archaeologists or anthropologists are recreating or co-creating that culture when they examine the artifacts. So you can see how this gets a bit messy, right? And you actually might get impatient and say, well, I just want to get on with research, my discipline has real problems in the real world that it needs to solve. But these are important questions because they're going to determine whether your research is rigorous enough for you or not, whether it's truth, whether it's acceptable in your community. So we share rules about this, and that helps us. Epistemology is what's acceptable knowledge in a field of study. And you can see this. I have a research partner who works with interviews purely, with elite interviews. So he believes that you can find out about the nature of society or governance simply by speaking to its leaders. Now, if you come from a more positivist background, you would say that that's rubbish because the leaders are going to present something and that might not be accurate. If you spoke to the man on the street, or better yet, spoke to a representative sample of the man on the street in that country, you might find a very different picture. Okay, so you can see that different fields have different evidence that they accept. So I might not accept something that's really subjective, but others might think that that's absolutely perfectly normal. This is coupled with ontology. So again, we go back to subjective and objective research methods and our understanding of what reality is. What is the best way of inquiring about the nature of the world is what we're asking here. Inquiring into the nature of the world. So what's the best way of finding out about reality? And that's obviously based on how we understand reality. What is knowledge? What are the sources of knowledge? And what are the limits of knowledge? So what is knowledge? What can be known? Now, what we arrive at here is that the truth in social sciences is this vanishing point. It's something we approach but we can never achieve. Because it might, and even in physics and stuff, the what we know does change, and truth changes a bit, but it changes a lot more slowly. Their rules are a bit more fixed. 1 + 1 is always 2. But the human development level, the unemployment level in a country could change changes from day to day, but we measure it from year to year. So we might know what is true in a specific society at a certain point, but then it's going to change because people are dynamic and the world is dynamic. So our limits of knowledge are that we can sort of be accurate, but we might not be accurate on that day. We might be able to describe what was happening last year. So you can see how epistemology comes in here. What are we measuring? Methodology is talking about how do we measure it, how do we make sure it's valid and reliable, but what is truth? What evidence do we accept here? Are we just going to sit around and talk about something, and is that then truth if we agree on something, or do we want some sort of objective, externally knowable stuff? So questions of epistemology are starting to overlap into research method, okay? And so you can see how these things are tied together. We go ontology, epistemology, methodology, and they actually interconnect. They're not sequential. They've got to be sort of knitted together all the time in a Gordian type knot. I hope that's the right word. You can Google it, and I can seem really stupid if Gordian isn't the right term. Now, I'm tempted to Google it, but I'm going to carry on. Okay, so epistemology is the theory of the method or the grounds of knowledge. So grounds in this basis is what we base our perceptions on. Okay, what are we basing this on? It's a set of claims or assumptions about the way in which it's possible to know reality, and how what exists may be known, what can be known, and what criteria must be satisfied in order for stuff to be known as knowledge. So I might not take something as fact purely through interviewing one person. I might want to observe it and speak to a bunch of people and test hypotheses. Someone else might accept speaking to one person as fact or truth about a subject. I wouldn't base a theory on one interview, but other people do. So epistemology is how and what it is possible to know, and the need to reflect on the methods and standards through which reliable and verifiable knowledge is produced. So you can think of this as the umbrella, and then methodology is sitting underneath this. Reliable and verifiable knowledge is the important part here too. So for us, we want fair knowledge, so we don't want to be biased against any group. We want reliable knowledge, so it must things we use must consistently measure what they're supposed to measure, and they must be valid. We must measure what we're supposed to measure. And this, in qualitative terms, is to do with rigor. The rigor means the energy or the accuracy with which something's done. Again, you can check it, I might be wrong, but that's my understanding of rigor. So epistemology, again, is knowing what you can know, or how you can know it, and what you can know and how you know. What is good knowledge and what's bad knowledge? And how can we represent or describe reality? Can we be certain about it? And they decide, well, again, they emphasize the same thing, that this is all one big knitted up knot or mess. Ontology and epistemology work together, and they're very closely tied with methodology. Okay? So you have to understand your assumptions about this, because they're going to inform your method later on. But surely you should just know this stuff anyway. Like, how can you exist on a planet and not question everything around you? How do you know you're not sitting in a bed somewhere in a coma and that you're imagining everything that's going on today? How do you know you didn't fall asleep and because my voice is so very boring and that you've dreamt all of this? How do you know the sky is blue? Well, the sky isn't blue. It's just reflection because of, if I remember correctly, the way the light moves through our atmosphere. So the sky's not even there, man. So think about these things. Okay, I like this diagram. It will help us to understand what I'm talking about a bit better. So the first question is, what is out there to know? What is truth? And that's our ontology. Objectivists think that reality exists outside of researchers. Constructivists believe that this is something that we create and agree on as researchers. How do we know what we know is epistemology. Positivists believe that truth is external to us. It's something that can be measured and discovered. We can write rules about the stuff and we can apply them consistently. Interpretivists say that we co-create reality. We discuss stuff. We interact. We agree on it, and this will change over time. If you think about things like women's rights, remember we didn't get the vote until relatively recently. What is true and what is right and just does change. So both are true, but different value of true. How do you acquire knowledge? Well, through methodology. We can use deductive, going from general information to specific evidence, or inductive. We can go from observing stuff to coming up with rules based on what we've observed. And then what procedures do we use? Finally, the methods. We can use quantitative methods. We can collect information and then interpret that information using hypothesis testing and stats. Or we can use qualitative empirical assessment. So we can collect observed data, or can interview people, discuss things until we've sort of absorbed enough into our mush in our heads and come up with some sort of conclusion, theory. So a bit more of the same. Your research philosophy could comprise positivism, realism, or interpretivism. Axiology is slightly different here. It's, again, I say it about ethics, about what we focus on and about how we focus on it. Positivism is the stance of the natural scientist, is that things can be quantified, measured, tested. Realism is about, we're going to look at direct and critical realism in this. It's about experiences of things, and that sometimes we have to understand that even though we experience something, it doesn't mean it's necessarily true as we experienced it, and that might not be the universal truth. And interpretivism is more about how we interact and agree on information. So positivist approaches are based on research approaches that look at empirical methods. They use quantitative analysis and they develop logical calculi to build formal explanatory theories. So it's more rigorous in the sense that you are setting up rules, anyone can use those rules, and you can replicate them, and then we come up with predictions. We can predict 10% of behavior. We can predict the likelihood of someone passing or failing or performing or not performing in the workplace. Realism is this assumption that our senses show us reality, and that's the truth. It believes that objects exist outside of our minds, so they're not created within our minds. It's not idealism. But then there's direct realism and critical realism. Now, direct realism says that what you see is what you get. What we experience through our senses portrays the world accurately. Critical realism says that our experiences are sensations and they're images of things in the real world, and they're not the things themselves. And they say, well, sometimes if you look at optical illusions and things like that, our senses deceive us. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because in our field we use positivism and maybe interpretivism more. Interpretivism advocates that it's necessary for researchers to understand differences between humans and our roles as social actors. So we have differences when we conduct research among people. So as opposed to how we might research physical objects. And as a result, because the social world is so different from the physical world, it needs different methods. And these methods are more reflexive, inclusive, and there's a lot more negotiation of reality. So interpretivist research looks at meanings that people attach to things like norms and the rules and values that regulate how they behave and interact with each other. We can't impose our own norms, rules, and values on others. So we can't be ethnocentric in our research or biased or judge people, make value judgments. Although having said that, that's more this cultural relativism approach, but I believe that there's a certain level of universalism. In other words, we can't judge people and say things are right or wrong when it comes to things that are specific to their culture. But I'm a South African, so our constitution sort of says that you have freedom as long as that freedom doesn't start to impact on the well-being of others. So it's the same. There are universal rules about how we should treat and interact with each other. And I think that it's okay to impose an understanding based on that. So axiologically, there are boundaries to relativism. There are axiological boundaries that impose a type of universalism in terms of what's right or wrong. At least as a South African, that's what I believe. So we can't focus on what people tell us about the reasons for their beliefs, but also on the practices and why those things are justified. So social practice gives meaning to social action. So we have to understand things within their context. We can't be completely objective. That might explain or rationalize or justify certain behaviors that don't seem particularly normal to us. So it's just asking for a slightly more open mind. And this is largely a reaction to colonialism and the ethnocentrism that was evident in research at the time. We have moved beyond that, but again, I must caution that we do need some sort of universalism. The pragmatism. Pragmatism is awesome. It's the best out the lot. I'm not at all biased about this. It's basically saying that ultimately you can't be too fixated on one method or one approach to the point where you actually only conduct research because you can apply your pet approach. Instead, you've got to look at the research problem and you've got to decide based on that problem. So constructivism is not going to work when it comes to measuring blood pressure. I don't care about a culture's understanding Well, I sort of do when it comes to the fact that you might need to understand a culture's understanding of blood pressure to manage it. But if I'm just measuring blood pressure, I'm going to use a positivist approach. At the same time, if I'm trying to reduce blood pressure in a community, I might use a more interpretivist approach and speak to people about blood pressure and how we can best appeal to them to reduce the blood pressure. But the focus is on reducing the blood pressure. It's not on touting a favorite approach, okay? So I hope that makes a little sense. If you want to look up critical pragmatism, which is where you identify problems in society and you work towards social justice and you employ whatever research methods are appropriate in order to achieve your objectives. So it's the most important determinant of your epistemology and axiology is the research question. It doesn't determine your ontology. In fact, most of these things are already predetermined in critical pragmatism. We understand that there is a truth, but we might never fully get there. That truth is something that is approachable, but we'll never fully arrive at. We understand that we must use whatever means are necessary, that we've got to agree and create consensus between people when it comes to subjectivity. So we can't be completely objective, we can be intersubjective. And all of this has already been sorted out. So read up about critical pragmatism. So our paradigm, again, is a way of explaining social phenomena from which particular understandings of these phenomena, a way of examining social phenomena from which particular understandings of these phenomena can be gained and explanations attempted. That's all it is. It's a way of examining them in a way that we can agree on and will help us to understand those phenomena, and it'll help us to explain those phenomena better. I said I'd talk about deduction and induction. The first stage of deduction is deducing a hypothesis. This is the silly part of this. To get to that phase, you need to actually go through an inductive process where you read extensively. So you observe all these different research reports or accounts from different people, and then you come up with a guess about what's going on, an educated guess. Then you operationalize your hypothesis. So how can I test my hypothesis? Then you test it, and then you examine the outcome, usually using inferential and descriptive stats, and then you modify your theory. So the beauty of this is that induction, the theory building, actually happens before deducing the hypothesis. So the guys who say that they're purely deductive are telling fibs. They actually use an inductive process without realizing it. They just do it on the slide before getting to what they see as the, and I'm using air quotes here, real science. So deduction is looking at causality some of the time. We can't assume causality all the time. We can't assume we're measuring it correctly all the time. So it's explaining causal relationships some of the time, but explaining relationships a lot of the time. Looking at controls for testing hypotheses, so using experiments. The research is independent or objective, and we use quantitative measurement. So concepts are operationalized. In other words, we find ways of measuring them, and we'll look at scales of measurement next time we get a chance to record a video for you. And these are generalizable, so we try and look at the population parameter. We sample statistics to measure variables, to look at associations between independent and dependent variables, and we then generalize them to draw inferences about the population parameter. Induction is building theory. So like I said, that's the exploratory stuff, and sometimes descriptive, and it comes before hypothesis generation and before deduction. So we build theory by trying to understand the way humans build their world, looking at alternative explanations of what's going on, so it's a little bit more ambiguous and open, looking at the context, using qualitative data and using lots of different data collection methods and triangulation to achieve rigor. Okay, so choosing your approach, you've got to understand your philosophy and your paradigm before going through that. You've got to make an informed decision and make sure that it's acceptable to your research community. Some research communities favor more quantitative research, unfortunately, because they're not critical pragmatists. They haven't seen the light yet. But You just have to make sure that the message is appropriate for the audience, or the medium is appropriate for the audience. Think about the strategies that will work for your research topic, so be pragmatic about it, and adapt your research to cater for any constraints you might have. So the major difference between induction and deduction, I guess I will upload these slides, but you can just pause and read through these. I don't agree with all of these. I think induction also works on scientific principles. They're just a bit more vague or open. We move from theory to data in deduction. We explain causal relationships. We collect quantitative data. We use controls. We operationalize the concepts. It's structured. The research is supposed to be independent or objective. We use big enough samples so that we can generalize. In terms of induction, we want to understand the meanings humans attach to events, so how they perceive and interpret things. We need to understand the research context. It's really rich, and this is why you need mixed methods, because I find that presenting the data is very useful, and sometimes you can get your points across, but more specific context-rich stories really help people to fully understand the extent of the problem, or understand how it might manifest in a real-world environment. Induction is a lot more flexible. It's got to be reflexive. So you might have to change your research design, change your research questions a few times as you go, and use mixed methods. So you are going to change your method even in order to get the full picture. They realize that the research is part of the research process. So remember, we can't get perfect objectivity. So we have to sort of understand that everything is processed through our worldview and our experiences. So they're just a bit more open about that. And they're not so concerned about generalizing. They're more concerned about the richness of the data. That's why these two approaches work so well together. Develop your theory using induction, and then test it. See if it can be generalized to the population, not just to your sample, through using deduction. Okay, finally, we look at two other important terms. EMIC, the insider's view and voice. So you can see that that's more to do with the qualitative side of research, and ETIC, the outsider's view and voice. Researchers are most often outsiders trying to understand a community, group, or individuals. So we hope that our measurement instruments give us enough insight, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you have to actually embed yourself in a community, or use participatory research to try and get a more emic perspective. Okay, so the social distance thing we were speaking about before comes into play here. So that's our lecture for today. Let's see if I can remember how to stop this thing.